Unicef has launched a podcast series to amplify the voices of young people with disabilities. The first podcast is produced in Namibia and highlights the difficulties children with disabilities face during especially this time of us facing the COVID-19 pandemic. Children from Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya and Somalia will also get to share their stories. Today is, after all, International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and joining me now from Kenya is Unicef's Yetnebersh. Molla. Yetnebersh, thank you so much for your time this evening and for making the time to speak to us. This is a very important day, and when we have days like this, it proves the fact that we need to have these days to shine a spotlight on something that's not getting enough attention. And when we speak about the inclusion of people living with disabilities, that includes the inclusion of their stories in the media landscape. And let's call a spade, that there are not enough stories being told that includes the stories of the lived experience of those living with disabilities. I'm sure you'd agree.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And persons with disabilities constitute 1/5 of the total population globally, which is up to 20% of our population globally has one or more forms of disability. Unfortunately, we don't see them that often. Their images are not represented, or they are misrepresented in the media, as you rightly mentioned. Yeah, today marks the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. And among persons with disabilities, we know nearly 1/4 of that population are children with disabilities, where UNICEF has a primary focus on. So it's critically important that we observe this day by committing to change towards the inclusive world that we all have promised in 2015 through the Sustainable Development Goals.
What kind of impact do you believe one could have for young people to hear these stories and have access to these kinds of stories of others living with disabilities?
Absolutely. I mean, the stories are mostly untold, and people are left to live and die with their assumptions, regardless of the length of time that disability was existing quite so long. Quite so many times, children are not encouraged to ask about disability, like parents do not allow them to talk about it. So it has been like a taboo. So with this podcast that we're launching today, we are featuring the different stories of children in different aspects of life. For example, from Namibia, we had experience of a girl who is blind, how she is dealing with the COVID-19 protocols and measures. And she shares about how she feels in her daily life, like when she goes to the mall, the practice of making sure that your temperature is taken. Sometimes people have mobile temperature thermometers. Sometimes it's on the wall. You don't know where the sanitizer is. So every adjustment takes more explanation and more way of adaptation. So in different aspects of life, in education, in employment, in early childhood development. So this is a podcast which is helping our listeners to navigate through the daily life of our children and youth with disabilities in Africa.
Now, I asked you about the impact on those listening to the stories, but I'm sure there's been an impact on those whose stories are being told, because we all need reminding that our own stories matter.
Definitely. The impact of those stories, the first thing is, of course, everyone's story matter. There is already a uniqueness in everyone's daily life. So it's critically important to understand how these children and youth with disabilities overcome those barriers. But it also creates the familiarity for the public, because it's not because the public doesn't want to include that we're not going into the inclusive world where we want, but so many people do not know how. These podcasts are informative of how those children and youth with disabilities can be supported, how their potential can be unlocked. They're not full of problems, rather they are full of solutions. They are full of ways to do things differently.
Speaking of doing things differently, young people also digest the media differently. And you obviously believe that a podcast is a different way to reach young people across the continent and not just using mainstream media. What was the decision in deciding on a podcast in the best medium possible to reach young people? And how are you hoping to distribute these podcasts across the continent?
These podcasts are going to be accessible for all online, for those people who have access to internet. All of them definitely will have access to them. And secondly, we will use different opportunities, including through schools, that these stories are told so that they can also serve to inform other children who do not have the exposure. These are stories of children which can be told for children with a view to shape our future to become more inclusive than ever. So the UNICEF will be using different opportunities through schools, listening clubs, online podcasts, so yeah, including this kind of medias. We will definitely make sure that alternative ways are used to reach out the large public. As you said, the youth also use a lot of social media. We also have You Reporter channels and quite a lot of it. So we are trying to use different means to reach out different parts of the youth population also in the continent.
So for those watching, if they want to go online and find it, where's the best possible portal for them to get their ears on these podcasts?
UNICEF has a UNICEF Africa page where they have also a link for the podcasts. The podcasts are live. Today we have launched around the different podcasts, but we will be launching a series of these podcasts for the coming 3 months. So definitely they can go to the UNICEF Africa page and then they can look for the podcasts, and definitely they will have access to that.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the work that you and your team are doing. A really great innovation there. That's UNICEF's Yetnebersh Molla joining us live there from Kenya, telling us about this podcast launched today on International Day of Persons with Disabilities, a podcast giving voice to children and young persons living with disabilities. It really sounds like it would be a very, very good and informative listen.